Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I think there are broadly two kinds of experiment in the last 120, 30 years, which are relevant even today, even if they have not succeeded in transforming our attitudes to hierarchy as yet. And those two broad ways, I will just use Gandhi and Ambedkar as figures who exemplify one and the other.
You just heard Dr. Rinku Lamba, Associate Professor, National Law School of India University, talking about caste and reforms in the modern period. The Indians is a collection of essays by some of South Asia's foremost historians and scholars that maps the origins, evolution, and present-day reality of India's civilization and people. The collection covers a period of some 12,000 years, from the last ice age to the 21st century. The book is divided into 7 sections: the evolution of humans and their life conditions, foundations, emergence and the decline of civilization, the language mix and philosophies in ancient India, cultures, subnationalities and region, colonialism, towards federalism, social and political movements, and India since independence. This BIC Talks mini-series, Histories of a Civilization, glimpses into the collection, presenting readings from selected essays interspersed with conversations with the scholar who wrote them, providing a sampling of the various topical discourses that cover the epochs of the subcontinent, and hopes to encourage our listeners to take a deep dive into what makes the Indians.
You have written a very admirable chapter in this book on history that Tony Joseph, Ravi Korishet and I did on caste and social reform. So thank you for writing that chapter. In the light of what Tony Joseph was saying, there is a good chance that more scientific knowledge might help us in reducing the caste distinction, if not discrimination, because discrimination is a result of settled economic interests, but distinction is a part of perception which emerges out of one's recourse to myth and legend and legacies and so on. So I if it is okay for you, may I ask you, if during the 20th century the attitude to the past was more influenced by the Western modernism, or was it increasingly moving towards pride in the Indian past? Because one would take us from caste to class, and the other would take us from colonialism to myth and legend.
I think there has been a recourse to the Western modern, and I wouldn't call it modernism. And there have been attempts to understand India's past in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, to understand India's past through a conceptual lens that is marked by things like nation state, or by the question of, glorious tradition, glorious past, glorious history for a nation in the making. So to answer your question, has there been recourse to modernism? Yes, if that means that there has been an attempt to also spell out something called a traditionalism, so a kind of competition, as Rajiv Bhargav puts it, in not modernity versus tradition, but a certain ideological construction of what the modern has, or what the traditional had and what the modern has taken away. There was a bit of that for sure. So I'm thinking now of the attempts that historians tell us on the part of different Indian elites to dress up in a certain way, to give up certain older clothing, and to produce a new sensibility of what it means to be contemporary in the colonial period. But I think another way to answer your question, and I think for me that's the more difficult but also the more meaningful way to address your question, is to ask about the way in which the Indian modern, by which I mean the openness to stand up for individual liberty, the openness to transforming a social order via recourse to legal means in the direction of addressing hierarchies, that attention to those aspects of what it means to be modern anywhere in the world. So the Indian modern is constituted through an attempt to engage with the past as well, which has occurred in meaningful ways as well as more rhetorical and somewhat ideological ways. So by meaningful ways...
Question is about the meaningful ways. In your reckoning, which have been attempts to address the caste issue during the last 200 years, which should have succeeded more than they did, I'm not saying that, I'm not using the term failed, but in your reckoning, experiments which deserved a greater success but did not attain that success.
I think there are broadly two kinds of experiment in the last 120, 30 years, which are relevant even today, even if they have not succeeded in transforming our attitudes to hierarchy as yet. And those two broad ways, I will just use Gandhi and Ambedkar as figures who exemplify one and the other. So I think Gandhi is interested in emphasizing the bond of love that must exist among different people, among groups that have been separated historically, so on and so forth, without reliance on a legal order to produce a certain kind of change. And I see that as requiring a lot of will. Gandhi is someone who's also very interested in the forces of compulsion, so a kind of discipline that people who are used to exercising privilege have to manage to somehow cultivate in order to see themselves as oppressors as well. But doing all of this through an emphasis much more on, let's call it the law of love, versus what Ambedkar would say is the efficacy of man-made law, right? So that's the idea that Ambedkar says in some of his writing, that love works very well within the family, but outside of the family, we need to think about things in terms of justice. And he thinks that the state has an important role to play in reordering social relations. So if you ask the question, what have been the failed attempts, neither attempt has been fully successful. And to my mind, they're both important figures because both these things have to happen together. More and more, we are seeing ourselves as a society in which separation among people is taking place on various grounds. So separation is coming in the way of a certain kind of like-mindedness that I'm wanted, for example. Right? It's coming in the way of right relations, again, something that Ambedkar stresses. And these things, like-mindedness, right relations, these cannot be produced by law. These have to be grounded in attempts made by power holders, as well as those that have been marginalized for a long time. Efforts have to be made to do something to bring us together, to bring us near each other. So I think both law, I would not want to give up on the resources of a law-governed order, and those are insufficient to actually generate ties among human beings through which the will to differentiate and dominate can be somehow curtailed. So difference, this production of a difference between myself and another and inferiorizing somebody else through difference, that's a kind of moral psychology that has to be addressed, which law alone cannot do.
I have one last question, and that is Gandhi's, as you say, Gandhi's way was change in the conscience. Ambedkar's way was giving legal rights to people. And what Mr. Tony Joseph was saying in that discussion, what emerged was if people know more about who they are, from where they came, how we are all mixed society. So knowledge. Spread of knowledge is one way of reducing the caste discrimination and hierarchy. Legal protection and safeguards and access to those safeguards is another way of reducing caste discrimination, at least minimizing the injustice arising. And third is change in the consciousness or conscience of individuals. Now, whether it is, I want to ask you a personal question of personal faith, whether in your opinion, ignorance about who we are is the breeding ground for difference, hatred, contempt and injustice, or whether it is a weak state which does not provide legal protection to citizens that allows a greater rise in injustice, such as mob lynching, for instance, at the moment. Or is it the lack of ethics for an individual that permits an individual to be an irresponsible citizen and treat others with contempt? So is it ignorance? Is it weak state? Or is it lack of decline in the ethical environment that become the breeding ground for caste difference, discrimination, and injustice?
Professor Devi, I'm sure you would agree that the three are related to one another. But I think in contemporary India, it seems like the last one is somehow shining as a site for more attention. That is the absence of, I don't know whether it's only individual because ethics is more social, but a certain difficulty to be more public spirited, which may be connected to ignorance, but I don't know how much it is only about ignorance anymore. Sometimes we know the correct fact, and it may be that the state is willing to do something and not blink at a certain crucial moment. But I think a more serious problem is a certain missing link among people to stand up for one another fearlessly. And why is that the case? Is it because of ignorance? Is it because of a weak state? Yes, both of these as well. But I think somewhere much more missing is, I would just use the word public spirited.
Well, we are besieged by all the three at the moment in this country. All the three. I will request you to read a couple of paragraphs from your essay.
Caste and reforms in the modern period. Attempts to delineate the unfolding of a modern social imaginary in India will be incomplete without focusing on issues of caste and reform. Caste as a system separates people and places them in a birth-based graded hierarchy. To be sure, pre-modern India witnessed a rich and sustained commentary about caste. The Bhakti tradition from Basava to Kabir, Ravidas and Tukaram included within its conceptual repertoire bases for normative opposition to conventional hierarchies. The tradition is marked by focused and robust attempts to persuade people through poetry and music to review hierarchies associated with caste orders. And yet, it must be noted, almost no Bhakti poet saint appealed to earthly rulers to transform the norms sustained by caste orders. Assuming that reform refers to restructuring or transforming something, the move to address caste and gender hierarchies via a turn to the law and state then becomes a crucial site for locating toward modernity in the Indian subcontinent. That is, the ideas and practices related to the reform of caste can shed light on some aspects of Indian modernity. These include, first, how the concern for liberty of individuals is mediated by attention to group structured inequalities. Second, these include the feature that discourses about freedom and non-hierarchy stem not only from non-religious doctrines such as liberalism, but also from conceptions of religion that are not reducible to conventional religious doctrines. I'm thinking about Gandhi's understanding of religion or Ambedkar's notion of the religion of principles. And the third aspect of modernity that attention to reform of caste can highlight pertains to the important place of the state and law in removing the burdens of socially sanctioned hierarchies. In different, complex, and even conflicting ways, modern Indian thinkers ranging from Jyotiba Phule, Pandita Ramabai, and Ranade, Mahadev Govind Ranade, to Rabindranath Tagore and B.R. Ambedkar, endorsed the political choice in favor of a law-governed order to address injustices perpetuated by caste hierarchies. Some of them recalled, construed, translated, or rejected elements of the persuasion-oriented bhakti tradition to power their political visions. For many of the reformers, the institution of what Ambedkar calls right relations among persons entailed prioritizing the elimination of injustice over the fulfillment of loyalty even to national causes. For Ambedkar, in fact, and I quote, "Political tyranny is nothing compared to social tyranny, and a reformer who defies society is a much more courageous man than a politician who defies government." End of quote.
M.K. Gandhi was less interested in the legal apparatuses of the state as suitable instrumentalities to rectify caste injustice. His faith lay in what can be called the law of love, whereas Ambedkar emphasized reliance on the force of man-made law to annihilate caste. Yet it may be better to approach the insights in their respective visions of social change in less adversarial ways, and D.R. Nagraj gestures nicely towards the possibilities in that reconciliatory direction. But why might it be better to approach their insights in convergent ways? Because, like many liberal democratic jurisdictions, India is still grappling with the problems of unequal social power, and the jury is still not out on whether to settle on love or law for addressing systems that separate persons from one another, something that appealed neither to Gandhi nor to Ambedkar. It is becoming increasingly evident that there may not be a sufficient bulwark against caste-related injustices. Perhaps that is why Ambedkar paid attention to the issue of religious conversion and even saw it as required to pursue the notion of democracy as a mode of associated living that is unimaginable without an important place for persuasion.
The abiding importance of a legal and constitutional framework with provisions like Article 17 of the Indian Constitution is indisputable. And it is also important to acknowledge that the workings of competitive democratic politics have transformed caste in the electoral domain from being primarily a vertical arrangement of groups to one that has assumed a more horizontal expression. Further, there can be no denying that access to political power and representation has augmented the self-respect of Dalits. There is a sense in which they can call the state their own. And it may well be that these important goods themselves push in the direction of keeping caste-based identification alive, giving new force to necessity-based reasons to retain caste. And it may also explain Mehta's observation that since independence, India has witnessed not anti-caste but anti-upper caste movements.
Consequently, transformation via politics has been limited. It is a politics of positional change, not structural reform. More fundamentally, he points out, there may be limits to what the state can achieve by way of creating new opportunity for Dalits and other marginalized groups. According to Mehta, marginalized groups will be in a position for more robust social advancement when they acquire the capacities to navigate a market economy successfully. The state's ability to distribute power is limited, and Dalit groups which have gained some access to power are often keener on preserving the privileges of their subcaste vis-a-vis others than in advancing general welfare. The division of labourers that Ambedkar associated with caste seems unabated, and caste continues to function as a graded system of sovereignties, even if social composition of groups that oppress Dalits in contemporary times stands altered. But expressions of the will to dominate through an imposition of violence on vulnerable groups continue to impede civility across and within groups in Indian society. And the continuation of endogamy, notwithstanding the phenomenon of migration for marriage in states like Haryana, too blocks a vital avenue for change. Legal and institutional efforts since independence to address caste-based marginalization through reservation in forums of political representation, as well as in state sector jobs and in educational institutions, have produced new perceptions of victimhood in the polity. Affirmative action schemes for vulnerable groups retain their normative relevance but have become sites for severe political contestation. And this is producing separationist adversarial social rivalries among citizens.
To be sure, public schemes to address historical injustice must not be given up. But recalling Judith Schklar, it may be wise to note that addressing public injustice and acknowledging the outrage of victims must not translate into a stance that victims are always right when they perceive injustice. We often blame ourselves and each other for no good reason. We scapegoat, we accuse wildly, we feel guilty for acts we never performed, we blame anyone who seems more fortunate than ourselves. To cast blame may offer some much needed relief, but it is unjust, though hardly blameworthy. The point here, I think, is to pay attention to the moral psychology of guilt, victimhood, blaming self or others that can attach to perceptions of injustice and to schemes for remedying them. The task is to somehow strive for a public culture that can address injustices without causing a spillover in the directions of blame and guilt. For these may sharpen unhelpful adversarial stances and regrettably make a politics centered on love appear even more remote. India is still a caste-ridden society, and older forms of separation are getting re-entrenched by newer versions of numbing and polarizing ideologies. Fortunately, social reform is an ongoing process, even if a slow and checkered one. It may help to conclude by returning to D.R. Nagaraj. He presciently underscores an already existent value-based commonality in the approaches to caste in the perspectives of Gandhi and Ambedkar. Both perceived the Dalit and caste question as a problem of value.
Nagaraj traces the militant history of viewing phenomena like untouchability as a problem equally related to both Dalit and caste Hindu societies, requiring changes in the value systems of both of these societies, as one that goes back several centuries, beginning with the Bhakti movement. But most importantly, Nagaraj highlights the political desirability of combining Ambedkarite activism with a Gandhian militantism to enable change through a process that insists on clinging to the other, thereby seeking to change the other.
Without this, a fundamental basic change in the orientations that sustain caste cannot occur. And I think Gopal Guru would agree somewhat with the spirit of Nagaraj's interventions, because Guru too is concerned about the lack of proximity that attaches to the social tension between the touchable and the untouchables. Things have changed drastically since the time of Gandhi and Ambedkar. Their reflections on social reform, taken together, might yet contain conceptual resources for addressing the fundamental problem of separation and disconnection within a political community that the system of caste perpetuates.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Just a last question before we close. Outside South Asia, are there nations societies which have such a rigorous caste system?
I can't think of something as rigorous as this. No, I'm unaware of anything as no. There are forms of hierarchies there are other hierarchies, but this one seems particular.
This is rather unique. India needs to think very seriously about this, because I don't see the possibility of India becoming a society of equals till we rethink the place of caste in our society, and it's a long battle.
Professor Devi, your question is also calling into attention something else about the debate about whether caste and race are the same. So I'm not going to address that over here. They are, but do they function together in a context like the subcontinents? The answer could be yes. Do they shape each other? So
well, class, gender, and race do bring in discrimination. Caste adds an enormous additional burden to those discriminations. And thank you for being a warrior in this battle of fighting caste and making our society more human. And greater power to your pain and greater strength to your struggle. Thank you indeed.
Thank you, Professor Devi.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.